So welcome everybody to this special event, which has been organised by UNICEF on innovation and how it can contribute to development. A week from now, on the 20th of November, we're going to celebrate and mark the 25th anniversary of the Rights of the Child Convention, which is a convention that has been most ratified in the world for children's rights. And I think it was a very important convention because for the first time it articulated that children possess innate rights equal to those of adults, the right to health, the right to education, to equal opportunities, to name but a few. In my own country, we've had recently a whole spate of allegations of historic child abuse which happened in the 70s and 80s, often before we had a convention on the rights of the child. And what keeps coming out of all this work of how did this abuse happen? How is it possible that it was tolerated? And a lot of the evidence is that the children were simply not believed because they were not seen as having rights and having the same access to justice as adults were. The adults were believed first. And I think that's a real lesson. And then in the United Kingdom, we changed our approach in social services to child protection, to have a child-centred approach. And that was a direct result of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it was an extremely important convention in developing countries, but also in many of our countries. So a lot has been achieved. But we still know that for many children never get to reach their full potential. Now 17,000 children under 5 die every day. I was trying to think, how many does that mean? While I've been speaking, how many children does that mean have died somewhere in the world because of some reason, which is probably caused by man-made or person-made reason for why children are dying every day, things that we can prevent. That's 6 million children a year. Children dying in poverty, of diseases because they are malnourished or undernourished. And then we're going to hear about the humanitarian and responses and the aid responses we need to give. We as the EU have a particular responsibility. We are the world's biggest donor. The EU and its member states donate 56% of global aid. And so we need to make sure that when we are giving our aid, we do so as effectively as possible, and we make sure that as many children as possible are able to live on to adult life and fulfill their potential. So as the chair of the Development Committee, I'm very happy to host today's event. I'm curious to know about this initiative of innovation and humanitarian aid and what it means in practice. What difference can it make? And we have a number of speakers here who are going to be speaking about that, and they're going to be introduced by UNICEF in a few moments' time. The intention of today's is called an Activate talk. And the idea is to think out of the box, I suppose, think about new approaches. And the title is The Promise of Innovation, Saving and Improving Children's Lives. Can Innovation Deliver? So we have to challenge our own assumptions, our own thinking, and hear from these innovatory approaches how we can do things better and differently in the future. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to UNICEF, and I've forgotten your name. Verena, who is going to, compare or moderate this discussion. I may have to leave at some point to go to a meeting about preparing a vote at 3 o'clock, but I'll stay as long as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for hosting us here today, and thank you all for coming and joining us here for the discussion. On behalf of UNICEF and on behalf of Philippe Corrie, the director of the UNICEF office in Brussels, it's an honor to welcome you, and it's an honor also to step in and to try to facilitate and moderate today's discussion. I will try to do my best to make sure that your ideas and your out-of-the-box thinking is made available and shared in this room, and then also taken outside this room through recording and through web streaming and through live tweeting, and that this is really meant to be the beginning of a conversation that we want to continue into the next months and years. It has already been said by Madam Chair that next week we will be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which when it was adopted was really a global promise to the children of the world that we would do collectively everything we can to have their voices be heard and have their rights realized. And much has, of course, been achieved. And what has worked for many children around the world, though, has not really worked for all of them. So while the gap has grown smaller between rich and poor, north and south, between children in urban and children in rural areas, too many children have their voices still not being heard. Too many children's rights are still being harmed and not realized, and too many children still today are not given the opportunities to really develop to their full potential. And this is really why the series of Activate Talks was invented and launched by UNICEF in the context of this anniversary year, by wanting to dedicate specifically the focus on what innovation can do to close that equity gap, and to bring those children that are still invisible, still out there, still forgotten, into the discussion, and to make sure that the solutions and the approaches and the ideas that exist are really designed for them and really reach them, so that 20 years from now we would be having a very different discussion. So this is why the Activate Talk series was convened, dedicated to innovation for equity, innovation for children. Similar talks have been held in places as diverse as Montenegro or South Sudan, and it's a real honor to be here today at the European Parliament for the first Activate Talk. But now I just want to also, as in my role as moderator, just share with you a few house rules so that we all know what we're in here today. As you know, the Activate Talks are either web streamed directly or recorded and later put and made available online. So this one here today will also be recorded. You see our colleague over there who is filming, and everything will be available again and free to be shared, forwarded and disseminated on UNICEF's innovation portal, which you can find on talks.unicef.org. We are also inviting you to tweet, to join the discussion inside the room, from outside the room, and we would invite you to use the hashtag UNICEF Activate so that we can pick up on the conversations and respond. And we also hope that you grabbed your sandwich outside, as much as we hope that there will be food for thought in this room. It's lunchtime after all, so if you haven't done so, maybe on the way out you can. And then maybe one last point. I'm very conscious we have very little time for a very big topic. So in the interest of time, in the interest of everyone's voices being heard, I would ask everyone to be as brief and to the point as possible. And also maybe one more request, which is Brussels specific perhaps. Let's all try to avoid as much jargon as we can. We've tried really hard, but there wasn't any fluent translator who could translate simultaneously from EU speak to DFID speak to UNICEF speak. So we gave up on this. So let's just try to use, a language that also outside anyone who follows this can understand and can make sense of as we go along. Now it's my honor just to now introduce our panelists, innovators, change makers, policy makers, thinkers who are here with us today. On my left, Ms. Henrike Trautmann. She is representing here today the EU Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Department, also known as DG ECHO. And in her capacity as head of unit there, she is responsible for many of the most important thematic and cross-cutting issues that will reappear in our discussions today, from nutrition to resilience to disaster risk reduction. But you also bring to the table, of course, both operational and policy-making experience, so you can dip into a whole range of relevant reference points that we look forward to hearing. On my right, Ms. Louise Bloom, you have joined us today from the Humanitarian Innovation Center, which is housed at the Oxford University Refugee Studies Center. And on the one hand, you have been a first responder yourself, having operated and worked in many crises in the world, but now you're actually studying specifically what is the role of innovation and technology in humanitarian and refugee assistance. So you will bring a different perspective to the discussion. On my right, it's an honor to introduce Mr. Klaus Rudischhauser, who represents here today as the Deputy Director, the EU Directorate for Development and Cooperation, also known as DG DevCo. And there you are responsible both for the design and now the application of the EU's development policies and the thinking that is sort of emerging out of Brussels and from the many delegations in the field, including also sustainable growth and human and society development. So we look forward to your thoughts. And then to my far right, it's a pleasure also to introduce Mr. Jonathan Wong, who has joined us here today in his capacity as head of the Innovation Hub at DFID, the UK Department for International Development. But more than that, you have also been a social entrepreneur yourself, and you have been advising and doing innovation for many years. So I think it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing your views on the debate. And last but not least, I'm also happy to introduce to you a virtual participant who, while not physically in the room, will be joining us via video message. And the special thanks here go, of course, to the European Parliament Sakharov Prize Network, who has made it possible for us that Ms. Hawa Ibrahim is able to join us via video message. Ms. Hawa Ibrahim is an accomplished and well-recognized Nigerian human rights lawyer, and the European Parliament has recognized her work and her contribution by awarding her in 2005 with the European Sakharov Prize. And I think without further ado, it's now over to Hawa to sort of set us off, and then we will going along the panel, and then we will open up for a discussion. Hawa herself speaks of the power of knowledge, the power of education, and the importance of education being both inclusive, culturally sensitive, empowering, and innovative. And so let's hear what she has to say before we turn back to this room. Over to you, Hawa.
Hello. As we celebrate this milestone of the promise we made to our children, the youth generation yet unborn, to protect and promote their right to survive and to thrive, to learn and to reach their full potentials, may I say congratulations for what we have achieved and for what we are about to achieve. The good book said, acquire knowledge, for indeed the acquisition of knowledge for the sake of Allah engenders reverence. Its search is an act of worship, and its study the glorification of Allah. Its research is a jihad, and its teaching to the ignorant is an act of charity, while offering aid to the scholar is a pious deed. I was born and live all my life in northern Nigeria, in Gombe State. I was a child in a poor family and raised in a Muslim home. My sojourn from a rural village in northern Nigeria to the revolving doors of Harvard University reminds me of the challenge and great opportunities that will all still emanate as we focus on fulfilling our promises of education to our generation yet unborn, which is a cornerstone of hope in our future society. 3 aspects is worthy of mention. Firstly, the integration and innovation of technology, curriculum and equity, the creative ways of teaching and learning. And secondly, the integration of religious moral values within community-specific and traditional knowledge in educational curriculum. Thirdly, the effective utilization of globalization opportunities to further development of education, especially that of children, the girl child, who is disproportionately disadvantaged. Now, balancing the global outlook toward progress is key in providing students with employable skills that will foster productivities and divert them from the temptation of terror, drugs, alcohol, and abuse. Now, wisdom dictates that with education comes employment, and with employment, an individual has the ability to help themselves and their family, especially the parent, and society and beyond. All too frequently in the past, parents have agreed to let their children forsake traditional cultural skill, that is, leaving their tools of trade, including hoes to farm, cutlasses, and rearing of cows and other domestic animals, in order to achieve Western education. In many such cases, these children have returned home devoid of any practical skills that could yield employment. As a result, parents in some societies are now becoming hesitant to accept the utility of Western education. After all, what is the point if it leaves their world skillless? Allowing community input of traditional skills and values, while also addressing the use of technology in education system, will result in students receiving an education that incorporates core values and morals and ethics within the dictates of their societal nuances. Education is a stovepipe used for enhancing a social change and sustainable development. It holds the capacity to preach tolerance, honesty, and respect. Failure to prepare and invest in education could invite extremists imposing their brand of education or lack of it, or blocking education, as it was in the case of the over 200 girls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. Now, investing in education does not only require funding, but it also requires engaging communities and recognizing specific needs, such as the absence of infrastructure. Example, classrooms, chairs, desks, electricity, books, and other basic learning facilities, and the sensitivity of remembering the farming seasons. As statistics indicate, the absence of education continues to affect the girl child ability to maintain a home, such as prenatal care, the birth control, as well as assisting in the homework of her children. Illiteracy hinders the amassing of broad knowledge and the cultivation of refinement and curiosity, resulting in patterns of inadequacies and frustration, ranging from the lowest economic level and to the other life pursuit. Addressing problems and opportunity in a rapidly changing world requires a new paradigm shift of social policy that transcend identity and politics, race, color, creed, and cultural biases. Rather than looking upon globalization as destruction of culture, such as advocated that Boko is haram, that Boko is prohibited. Now let us think about it that Boko is halal. Boko is admissible, is wanted. So Western education has been said we should be sensitive and inclusive. Now, innovative education offers the ability to communicate and disseminate new ideas in areas of scientific technology, knowledge needed to reduce poverty, inequality, and illiteracy, as well as facilitating and establishing of international ethos of shared values and principle of social justice. Thank you, and have a wonderful meeting.
And now let me maybe move from Hawa's view and experience in Nigeria to Sharat, who is here on my left. And let me just throw it to you the first question. I remember you said some time ago that today we can bring an astronaut to the moon. So obviously we should also be able to bring education to every child. And within UNICEF, you also define that innovation is not just improving or inventions and technologies, but it's really about delivering results for children. Now, may I ask you, as director of the Global Innovation Center, what has the center really done to save and improve children's lives?
Well, thanks. One of the things that we've observed is that it's very difficult for large organizations to actually invest in concepts because there are strict demands of them of accountability, return on investment, etc. And frankly, the cost of transaction for small amounts of money to do convert concepts into evidence is the same as actually scaling up a large program. So they are always hesitant on investing, or they find it very cumbersome to invest in taking concepts to a stage where they can be invested. And so what UNICEF has decided is that maybe UNICEF can play that role. Maybe UNICEF, because of its presence in 190 countries, at the grassroots level, working across governments, working across communities, maybe that is where we can use our presence on the ground to kind of identify good ideas, good concepts, good practices that could then be backed with science and rigor to see the possibility of replicability, the possibility of their sturdiness of deployment, their ability to be relevant and sensitive to the needs of the grassroots. And that's how the Global Innovation Center has been set up. The Global Innovation Center, the important thing is not about UNICEF. It's a Global Innovation Center for Women and Children, which essentially means UNICEF is only one of the clients. It is about the idea and not about the organization, and I think that's an innovation in itself for UNICEF to do that. The other part is that it focuses on scale up. And when I talk about scale up, it's focusing at least at the country level, if not the continent. And the reason for that is that you can have thousands of small pilots, but there is a tipping point for any idea to actually become a practice. And for that to happen, there has to be a big number. We don't know what that number is. And we said, if you take a country as a unit, maybe that should work. To give you an example, there's an application called M-Track, which basically was developed in Uganda to see notifiable diseases, to also find out drug stockouts, because that's a very common problem in Uganda where patients are there, the health worker is there, but the drugs are not there. And then vacancy rates and absenteeism is also a big idea, a big issue. So we developed this working with some NGOs and with the health workers themselves, because we firmly believe that anything or any data that is collected and any application that is developed has to be developed by the people who are going to use it, and the data that you collect has to be the data that is actually actionable and can be used at the level at which it's collected. The challenge nowadays is that 70% of the data that is collected from the field is actually to report to someone else and not actually to take action in the field. And that's why big systems don't work. So we developed this system with the health workers and the civil society partners and Ministry of Health, and then demonstrated that it actually works, it's relevant, and it makes a difference. And then DFID, Jonathan, came in and put in the money, and in 1 year, we were able to scale it up into the whole of the country in Uganda. With the result now that the reporting rate has gone up from 5% to 65% in 1 year, and at the same time, the reported drug stockouts have gone down from 70% to less than 30%. Now that's a simple idea which actually can make a big impact. And it's also about the tipping point, because we were talking country. There are no ifs and buts whether this system will work or not work. It's working. Every single health center, 14,000 health centers are using it. The other area that we focused on in our work was a large number. I mean, Africa is a very young continent. In fact, if you look at most of the developing countries, a large number of proportion of population is young. The young, most of them are now educated, at least up to secondary level. If not, almost everyone is primary level, but a large number up to secondary level. And they don't have jobs. The idea of education and the promise of education was two things: that education would lead to citizenship and education would lead to employability. And in fact, today education is not fulfilling any of the two, either of the two. So these young people think that they have done what the society asked them to do, but they are getting no returns. They're frustrated, they are angry, they think no one listens to them, no one hears what they have to say, and therefore they are vulnerable to be exploited by any of the parties with vested interests. So what you see of Arab Spring, and people keep on talking about Arab Spring being an outcome of social media. No, social media was a tool. It was the anger and frustration of unemployment that actually led to Arab Spring. We're seeing, even in Europe, we are seeing small incidents leading to major crises. And that's not because it is that incident, it's all that pent-up anger that is not finding an outlet. So we felt, and Uganda, Uganda I keep on saying because I was based there, we have 400,000 people actually passing out of the secondary school every year. Only 100,000 get a job. So you're creating a group of 300,000 people, frustrated, angry youth. And the question is, how do you make them feel included? How do you make them feel that their voice matters? How do you make them feel that someone is listening to them? So we started something, a simple thing called U-Report. It's an SMS-based service. Twice a week, we actually communicate with them. We started with 10,000 people. In 2.5 years, we now have 270,000 Ugandans covering every single village, every single part of the country, actually self-enrolled. They self-enroll. And every day we get at least 100 more who self-enroll, which essentially to us is a sign of success. So what we do is float questions twice a week, get their opinion, and then aggregate that information, put it in a newspaper, have a television program, and 14 radio stations where we actually bring in government, parliamentarians, to actually discuss, civil society partners, to discuss the issues that the young people are raising. One of the interesting things which we had not planned for in the beginning, what happened was, and this would be of interest to you in ECHO, is we had a banana wilt disease. Now, UNICEF has nothing to do with bananas. UNICEF, a banana is a very agricultural kind of thing, right? But what was happening was banana is the third largest export of Uganda. The banana fruit was becoming smaller and yellow and was dying. And the Ministry of Agriculture actually went to World Bank and said, listen, we need about 3 or 4 months and $500,000 to actually figure out where the epidemic is and how we can then act on it. We said, give us 12 hours. We sent a question to the U reporters, and within 12 hours, we could actually map where the epidemic was, and we actually engaged the U reporters in those areas to then work with the farmers to control the epidemic, which was done in 3 months. World Bank published a paper in March, I think, of this year, which said that the U reporters saved Uganda $369 million. The thing here is not about the U report. The thing here is, if you actually engage in a regular conversation with the young people, not only do you diffuse that negative energy, you make them feel good, and then they can become a major resource in being not even early informants, but also early responders to emergencies and crises. Because no matter how big an organization you are, no matter how coordinated we are, we cannot be at every place, and especially in the time that is required for an emergency. The only people who are there are the people who are living there. And the only people who are most interested in solving their issues are the people who are experiencing it. So we have the World Humanitarian Summit coming. In the last 30, 40 years, we have been very good in responding to emergencies. We've kind of made a science out of response to emergencies. But it still takes us 3 to 4 weeks because before we actually get our act together. And very often, when an emergency happens, we all behave as if this is the first time this has happened, and it never happened before. And it would never be possible for external partners, no matter how good the intentions are, to be there everywhere on time to do something. And the question then is, shouldn't now the conversation move away from a patron-client relationship, predominantly patron-client relationship, where we have the answer and the solution and we provide it to you, to actually thinking on how can the community become the first informants and the first respondents to any emergency that happens, and we come in with the additional things that are required. And tools like U-Report actually make it happen. U-Report is now in 8 countries. We just launched something called Rapid Pro. One of the challenges is that because we are all well-intentioned people and we want things to happen, we all have our own projects, and we all developed tools, and we all developed computer programs and applications, but none of them talk to each other. And in fact, the same organization in one country is developing something, in the other is developing something, and the tools don't talk, so we don't benefit from the big data or the intelligence and the learning that happens from one project to the other. So the idea was, and then why should every NGO, every time there's an emergency, have to invest in putting together an IT infrastructure, in putting together an IT program to start working on that particular emergency? So our idea was develop something which is open source, which is free, which is available to everyone, and that doesn't require a single word of coding to actually develop the application. We could also develop templates already. We know if you have a diarrhea, this is the template. If you have earthquake, this is the template. And you can have in a disaster situation a combination of templates actually operating, so you are getting the information, and in the real time, and through simple tools that are already available, not about bringing in smartphones, etc. How does that work? So in Liberia, Ebola, I mean, everyone is familiar with that. So when the Ebola crisis happened in Liberia, everyone came late, but we went there, took U-Report and another tool we had, which was dealt on what I call Rapid Pro as an application, put it together. In 3 weeks, we were able to actually put an information system that connects young people. It was developed customized locally with 60 young people, 30 of them girls. And in 3 weeks, we are able to launch what we call mHero, which essentially not only collects people, but draws out the IHRS database. IHRIS is the largest health worker database in Africa, which is run by USAID. So we were able to pull out data from there, connect it there, connect the young people and the health workers, because the biggest challenge in Ebola is how do you dispel the rumors? The treatment part is known, and yes, it is very complicated, very expensive, but the biggest problem of the spread in Ebola is the rumors and misinformation that is coming and the people who are disappearing. Give you another example in DRC and Uganda, a lot of population movements. How can we use the tower data from the cell phone towers? Because every cell phone has a pattern of use. So what we did was we talked to some telecom companies and were able to take aggregated tower data, not individual cell phone tower data, because that's a privacy issue, but aggregated data that 50,000 people are using the tower here. And we said, if you see a switch, sudden switch in the pattern, would you let us know? And we could actually then predict where the people were moving into Uganda. And we had a 2 to 3 day head start, because the tower data was moving. 50,000 phones here suddenly became 30,000, but they kept on increasing on the Uganda side. I mean, these are very, very simple tools. Next year is Europe's Year of Development. Now, can we imagine 2 scenarios? I mean, you are big players in the humanitarian field. Can we imagine a possibility that ECHO or Europe, in whichever form, I don't know the details of configuration, but can we imagine a global development or humanitarian cloud where all these tools are actually sitting? So imagine a humanitarian app store and a humanitarian cloud, which is hosted by Europe, where all humanitarian workers, all development organizations, if they are willing to share the data, can actually go take the application, deploy it out of the cloud. Imagine all that data coming in, and then you suddenly have a big data revolution happening, which Europe would actually be supporting. That's powerful, right? We can talk about how in Uganda all the 400 parliamentarians are on U-Report and how they're talking directly to the young people, because we've been able to connect them with their constituency. I can go on for the whole day, but I know the time is limited. I'll stop here. And I hope that maybe European satellite companies can actually create hotspots in emergency areas where we can actually tap into data and provide connectivity. I stop here.
Thank you, Sharat. Let's keep dreaming, and I think you raised a number of very concrete issues, and not to let Klaus off the hook, since there was a lot of discussion on humanitarian cloud. A lot of this is also, of course, possible and doable and necessary in the development area, and especially in that sort of gray area that straddles the humanitarian and development area, which we refer to often as fragility. And DG DEFCO, your house, of course, is focusing development aid increasingly on fragile areas. So the question to you is really what difference can innovations make in these contexts? And how can we work together to make innovations actually add value for children in these fragile contexts?
I'm afraid I could also go on for the whole day, but I will try to be much shorter and just try to make a few points also related to your question. First of all, thank you very much for convening this. I think it's an interesting idea to look at development assistance or development cooperation for a moment from the angle of innovation, because normally we obviously look at it from the angle of our objectives. What do we want to achieve? We want to make sure that so many children are vaccinated, that they survive birth in the first place, that they're vaccinated, that they go to school, that eventually, as you said, they find a job. So normally we look at the objectives, and our main line of work is how to best use the development money that we have at our disposal in order to reach a maximum of impact, meaning to reach a maximum of our objectives and improve or save the lives of a maximum of children. So that means we don't normally look at it from the angle of innovation, but I think it's a good idea to spend a moment on this. And I think, I mean, in general, there can be no doubt that this is actually a good idea to see how innovations could actually improve the way we work. This is, I think, for us the main question. How can we actually, by innovative approaches, improve the way we work? Now, I'm not saying that we are good at that. We are a big machinery, we are a big tanker, and to bring in new ideas is not always easy. You said that quite rightly, and I would certainly think it applies to us as well. On the other hand, in thinking about what I could say in terms of useful messages, I think that we actually are continuously trying to innovate in our work. And that is not always easy. That has an additional cost. That's true as well. But I think we are trying to innovate. And let me just give you a few examples where I see we have made innovations. By the way, the simple answer to your question about fragile states is we have been very much at the forefront of developing a new way to address fragile situations, which is now called the New Deal. In which we are very active and where we try a totally new way of development cooperation with, especially engaging very strongly with partner countries. So innovation is there at a more macro level, but the New Deal is definitely a big innovation in dealing with fragile states, and I think it starts yielding very good results in situations like Somalia and Central African Republic and others. So that's an example for innovation. Another one which I think is important, and you also mentioned that already, is actually to give young people a voice or to listen to young people, because when we do normal development assistance, we talk with governments or we talk with NGOs or we talk with established actors. We don't actually necessarily engage with young people. Now, for example, what we did is in the 3 EU-Africa summits which we organized, we had a youth summit where we invited young people to say what they expect from the relations between Europe and Africa. And that, I think, was a very useful exercise. And we now work very actively with World Vision, with a group of youth ambassadors, which very often come to events and really bring the voice of young people, because I think that is indeed very important. Now, for the rest, when it comes to innovation, I would look at it from very different angles. There is the technology angle, clearly, and a lot can be done with technologies, and there's no reason whatsoever why technological innovations should not also be used in development cooperation, and they are indeed. I mean, if we talk about money transfers, if we talk about applications in the medical field, if we talk about birth registration, which nowadays can be done through mobile phones, there are many applications where you really use technological advances in general. We don't do enough of that, especially if you look at Africa. There is still far too little connectivity. There is too little access to the internet, to modern technology. So this is something where, in my view, much more could be done. Now, this is not necessarily development assistance, but it could help to also improve the way we work. But then I think we also have to innovate in terms of new ideas which don't necessarily even use a lot of technology. Let me just give you 2 examples. We have developed a multidisciplinary approach to the problem of undernutrition or stunting of children with the whole nutrition and resilience approach. In both we work now in a multidisciplinary way, and this has not been done before. So when it comes to resilience, this is to avoid that crises become catastrophes every time. And when we talk about nutrition, it's how to make health, education, agriculture, and other areas work together in order to improve the nutrition situation of children. And I think this is a very important new approach which is starting to yield results. And then sometimes it's, what I find surprising is that very simple ideas can actually change very significantly things. I take the example of what we do in Somalia with girls' spaces in schools. The fact of the matter is that in Somalia, many girls do not go to secondary school. Why? Because in the specific situation and the religious background, girls are not supposed to eat in public. They're not supposed to be seen to go to the toilet or even wash their hands and other things. And therefore, they just simply do not go to school because they cannot. Now, what we did is we put next to schools a girls' room where girls can be amongst themselves, where they can look for all these basic necessities, and now they go to school. So this is a very, very simple but very compelling and very, very convincing example of how good ideas, innovative ideas, can actually change the way we can deliver our assistance on the ground and be much more effective and obviously bring the benefit of our work to more children, as it were, to more girls, as it were. So this is just to give you a very few examples of how we innovate all the time, and I would even claim that no one has an overall view of what is happening, especially we as a very large donor. We have lots and lots of good examples, but this is not my message. My message is we are obviously very interested to hear from UNICEF and from all other people who actually focus on how we could be more innovative so that we can bring that into our system, and then we have the means to implement it and to scale it up, and I think that's where our potential lies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, and I think as you said, it's the partnership and bringing the solutions to those who can scale up and those who have the ideas, linking them up with some of the solutions that may not yet be adapted to the context we're working in. It's now a pleasure to turn over to Henrike. We have already touched on challenges and opportunities of innovation in the humanitarian settings. We've heard of examples of how innovation has been saving lives and has also been improving lives. We heard specifically also, Sharat shared the example of how technology and youth engagement can help and hopefully help fast to fight the Ebola outbreak. But more big picture, from your perspective in ECHO and from your perspective with your own experiences, what, in your view, are really the challenges to innovation in the humanitarian system, and what has and what will ECHO do to bring innovation into the humanitarian system and to change and improve our approaches and methods?
Thank you very much, Verena, and thanks a lot for organizing this event. Interesting both in terms of format and in terms of input, so thanks to the Parliament and to UNICEF. And maybe I'll come a little bit to the defense of the humanitarian sector, who's always seen as being slightly anti-innovation and slow in moving around because it's all about life-saving and the humanitarian principles and all kinds of stuff, so there's no room for doing things differently, which I suspect is not completely true, because there's a lot of innovation already out in the past and it keeps on being developed. I mean, we thankfully had sandwiches for lunch and not something like Super Cereal Plus or Plumpy Nuts, but of course we could have had that for lunch, because it has actually been absolutely determining nutritional outcomes for children, specifically in the last couple of years since these things were developed. And it's something that obviously as a humanitarian donor, ECHO hasn't developed, but we have been pushing our partners quite actively to use it, and our partners have been pushing it. So there you have private sector also and humanitarian agencies coming together and being able to really move things forward. And as you probably know, this is still being developed as we speak, because now we're looking into ways of using these nutritional products on the basis of things which are developed, which are locally available, i.e. you don't have it all produced in France and then shipped all over the show. You try to make it, you try to produce this on the basis of chickpeas, for example, in Southern Asia and other places. So innovation is ongoing. Of course, what we have been very much also interested is in a move from food aid in an in-kind form to food assistance in the last, let's say, 10 years. We all remember when basically food aid was exclusively in kind and based on whatever was available in the Midwest in terms of grains. Now pushed by the partners, but also I think very much actively pushed by a couple of the large donors, it has moved to much more cash-based assistance, both in terms of cash but also in terms of vouchers. And that is hugely innovative, because not only it makes the whole exercise potentially more cost-effective, it cuts out on large logistics exercises. It gives people more dignity because they actually have a choice in what they want to do with the assistance they get. And it also has got us away from this completely opaque area of we give something to people and we're not really sure whether they can actually eat it or want to eat it or know how to cook it or have enough water to cook it, because you can't cook rice with a little bit of water like that, but you can cook other things like that. So it's being bartered away and nobody has a clue whether any of the targeting and any of the outcomes we were looking for actually has worked or not. So this is something we want to continue to push, and we see it as a huge step in innovation. There is a lot of other examples, and a lot of them have already been touched upon. The fact that 10 years ago nobody had a phone in Africa, and these days everybody has a phone in Africa, including in refugee camps and very remote areas, is of course not something that humanitarian aid has done. This is the private sector and innovative ways of dealing with challenges in Africa in terms of communication has done. But of course the innovative approach and the innovative possibility of this move to mobile phones has been hugely exploited. And as Sharat has already mentioned, and a couple of my colleagues, we know there's enormous potential still in that. So whether we talk about further satellite-based mapping of movements or using mobile phone data, or whether we look at crowdsourcing, both in terms of how is the damage pattern after an earthquake or a hurricane, or whether we look at people phoning in or using social media to tell us about the assistance needs there are, is something that will certainly develop further. Now, I will put a little bit of a bemol on that, because still you need somebody to do the assistance. And this is the other question. This is, of course, something, just to come back to Ebola, we see quite radically. Of course, we know where we have to deal with Ebola, but there is just simply not enough health workers around, neither international nor local. So without wanting to put into question the possibilities of using data, you still need people to do it. What I think we all agree on is that we have to get away from this idea of humanitarian aid as something Western that comes in is then being brought to people who can't do it themselves. That is totally wrong. And this is where innovation has a large role to play in enabling local communities, local societies, whatever is there locally, to better deal with the humanitarian crisis. And again, whether it is talking about accountability efforts, whether it's talking about using, for example, surveys, quick, light touch surveys of beneficiaries of what kind of assistance they would like to have, apart from the question whether we can give it to them, but at least have an idea what they would like to have, is something that certainly will have to be used more in humanitarian aid. I mean, you still have the classical example, if you go to a refugee camp, and these days you ask people what they want to have, and they want to have protection and education and connectivity, and what they get is a blanket and a bucket. So there is scope for doing better, and and I think this is very recognized in the humanitarian community. The World Humanitarian Summit has been mentioned already once or twice. As you know, one of the thematic topics there is indeed innovation, and there's large hopes of how to be able to use that. And I think we will be able to get a lot out of it. As a humanitarian donor, what we see our role in is a little bit creating and enabling context. I mean, it's not for us to do innovation in that sense. For that we have private partners, for that we have the large agencies, NGOs, lots of individuals who come up with good ideas. Of course, the challenge for everybody is to pick out the ones that are really drivers of change and kind of leave aside the ones that remain gadgets. Because, of course, I mean, if I only talk to all the people who want to introduce new winterized tents to ECHO, I'd be spending all my day with that. And this is the challenge we all have to face. That must be the same for UNICEF, it's probably the same for DEFCO, and a lot of colleagues here differ. But we have to have an open mind, and we have to have enough knowledge also on what is happening on the ground to be able to pick the real winners in that. And we have been able to pick some of them, and we probably missed out on some other opportunities. And this is something where we plan for the next, the immediate future to really put more emphasis on, i.e. in getting a better overview, bringing people together who work on different topics, having them exchange ideas, and then to a certain degree also provide a little bit of seed funding for some of the issues that we think really should be moved forward. That doesn't have to be all in terms of capacity building. Some of it is just being able to fund a couple of projects who use these approaches in a concrete humanitarian setting. Because that indeed is something where we're being a little bit conservative in this kind of, oh, it's all a crisis, so we can't really think about anything else because we really have to deal with the crisis at hand now. There I think the whole sector is starting to move quite radically. And for the context of the Humanitarian Summit in 2016, we hope to really exploit that further. And I hope we'll come back to this topic, and happy to see so much interest also. And again, thanks a lot for organizing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrike. I think we'll take you up on the offer to continue that conversation, because as we all agree, we are now here throwing out ideas and challenging our thinking, but it's a question of doing the right things afterwards together. I would like to hand over now, continuing the discussion from where Henrike left off, to invite Louise. From your perspective, both having been a responder and now researching and sort of thinking hard about what is the role of innovation in improving systems, in improving humanitarian responses, in improving our thinking also, what role now really, I mean, we assume that there's a big role it plays, but what role really do you think innovation actually plays in saving lives and improving these systems?
Thank you very much. As has already been introduced from our research at the Humanitarian Innovation Project, we've seen an interest in innovation grow dramatically in the last few years. But we've also noticed a gap, and that gap is in understanding how to facilitate the innovation and the creative ideas and skills of affected communities, perhaps for equitable innovation. So our work has looked at this growing trend in innovation thinking and practice for humanitarian and development ends. But we've seen this innovation grow perhaps in two different ways. The first is a drive for international agencies to improve their organisational management and perhaps create new technologies. But also this second, to try and understand and support the innovation that exists among the affected populations at the grassroots, as we've already heard from Sharad. And it's this second type of innovation that actually we see as a key role for innovation if it's going to deliver. And that perhaps equitable innovation should be one that facilitates innovation from within the communities that are being served. So our research so far has focused on refugee communities living in Uganda. Our point of departure has been to focus on the livelihoods activities and the innovations that refugees have themselves. The refugee-led businesses that we've found have actually played a crucial role in allowing those families to find their own social and economic freedoms. And that's included, importantly, supporting their children's education and welfare. There are now 16.7 million refugees worldwide, and almost half of these are below the age of 18 years. And with an average length of stay in exile of nearly 20 years, many children are born as refugees. And they're often born into camp situations where they have limited rights and freedoms. So for us in Uganda, actually, it presented a relatively positive case of refugees. They're given the right to work and relatively good freedoms of movement in Uganda, where innovation can possibly thrive. So our team spent over a year in Uganda working alongside refugee researchers to capture these examples of grassroots innovations that too often go unnoticed. So we conducted a large-scale survey with 1,600 refugees living in Uganda. And our data actually showed that over 90% of refugees have some form of income. And they're often in diverse businesses. Finishing primary school was also associated with 21% higher income. And when asked, over half expressed a strong preference for educational and business support over other forms of aid, as we've already heard. Through the research, we've met many youth-led innovations, initiatives that have played a key role in supporting the refugee communities. So I just wanted to share with you two stories of two young Congolese refugees that we think provide inspiring examples of youth-led innovation and who are contributing to the improved lives of the many refugees living in the rural settlements in Uganda. So the first is a story of a Congolese man named Kay. He was a new arrival to Nakavali settlement, which itself was over 50 years old and now home to over 60,000 refugees from several different countries. Kay, although new to the settlement, had arguably catalysed more connections than any other refugee living there. Using the UNHCR-initiated internet cafe, Kay had taught himself electronics online and how to create a radio transmitter. He collected spare electrical parts and an old mobile phone to build his own radio. The radio that he created transmitted up to 10 kilometres radius in the settlement. It was really technically impressive, perhaps an unexpected technology to find in this small mud hut in the hot and rural settlement. Alongside his youth group, he had used this technology to open a radio station, and this is the only radio station in Nakavali settlement. So the radio plays music, but it's also a platform for discussion and important information dissemination within the settlement. The youth group had started to make a small income by charging for song requests, and after only 1 month of broadcasting, they'd already managed to reunify a family through the information that they provided. So the radio is still going strong, and it's run by its youth volunteers, providing a unique but vital service to the communities around it. It's perhaps a point in case that old technologies or simple technologies, along with community volunteerism, are still key ingredients for the success of innovation in this development context. My second story is of Takamaze Ziombera. He was in fact a researcher with us on our project, and he was also the co-founder of a refugee-led youth organisation, which has brought access to education to more than 500 young refugees. In Changwali, the settlement where Takamaze had spent the last 15 years, they only had one primary school and no secondary education for the thousands of children living there. Takamaze's youth group of refugees set out to fight for a better access to education for themselves and their peers. After one member of their group received a scholarship from an international agency to attend a secondary school in the nearest town, the youth group negotiated new positions for other refugees to attend the other schools nearby. They raised money to pay for a hostel where students lived during term time, and they advocated for better education. And in the settlement, they also advocated that parents were shown the importance of this education. They also impressively, independently built their own new primary school in the settlement, obtained from working on farms as a group during their holidays. The organisation is now made up of over 8,000 volunteers, and it's formally registered as an NGO in 3 different countries. And through this education that he has accessed through his own organisation, Takamaze is a MasterCard scholar now, studying civil engineering in the US. So our research, we think, has demonstrated that the skills, talents and aspirations that many refugees have, they also have to innovate. They're often undermined by external innovations, and little is really understood about the way affected communities themselves are going to be, that they're going to kind of innovate for their own social change. And at the heart of innovation thinking, as we've heard a little bit here already, is collaboration. And it might be a tired term, perhaps in the UN, but collaboration with non-traditional partners, perhaps with these existing and thriving communities themselves, is going to be a vital piece of the innovation puzzle. So for us, innovation is not about one new idea or a new technology, but it's about the way that that idea is taken into the communities and scaled. So thinking first about the existing practices and capacities of the affected communities, then innovations, we believe, will scale more appropriately. Innovation can provide a framing to question the assumptions of typically top-down initiatives and build on the inspiring and dynamic new ideas from communities themselves for equitable innovation.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think there's a common thread that we all seem to be agreeing that a lot of the solutions, you don't need to look maybe too far, but you need to actually engage communities as the front line, as the battle, the first responders, the first informers, the key informers, and even very often the innovators themselves. Jonathan, it's your turn now to help us take the debate a step further. And I also wanted to mention and warmly welcome MEP Jezek, who joined us here, who I see is listening in carefully, and will be able to translate also some of the discussion as we hope also here into your daily work. But Jonathan, I looked at your Twitter account last night a bit sneakily, and when you sort of look there, you find, of course, the full range of questions that one could debate today, from mobile responses to Ebola, to inspiring examples of young innovators in the field, to the more tricky political questions of development, innovation, financing. But really, I think I just wanted to ask a very straightforward, simple question. What has not yet been said, do you think really needs to be done to develop better, cheaper, and faster solutions that really make a difference?
Sure. Many things, but in the interest of time, I will focus on two. I mean, when I joined DFID to set up the Innovation Hub some 2.5 years ago, there was two things that I wanted to do. I wanted to bring new voices to the table, to the development debate, and I wanted to create mechanisms for true collaboration. A lot of people talk about collaboration, it's tough and it's painful, and how could we make it kind of a low friction process? Just to step back slightly, I think the context is really important here. I mean, the development landscape's dramatically shifted in the past 5 years. There are new foundations out there. It's not just the Gates Foundation. You have foundations in Africa, you have high net worth individuals all over the world wanting to give back. You've got a new asset class of investors. No longer are venture capitalists, which is the background I come from, just looking to invest for pure commercial gain. They're looking for social impact as well. You've got multinational organizations, kind of huge corporate organizations, not talking about CSR anymore, but actually looking at how they build social impact into core business. There's a whole range of technologists, creative types, designers, a whole range of new actors looking at how they could make a profound impact in the developing world. And also there's been this rise in the concept of social entrepreneurship. So these are kind of young people who are looking to start new businesses with an ingrained social purpose, but also seeking commercial viability. So I think it's not just NGOs, donors, and international organizations anymore. There's this whole range of actors. And the question is, how do we bring them to the table? Because I think there's a lot for them to add there. The second point is around collaboration and being quite a geeky innovation type. What struck me in the development community is that we've used competition as a drive for innovation. So traditionally, donors set a challenge. So how do we get high quality education to marginalized girls? We set the challenge, organizations bid through tender processes, they compete. And the best proposals come to the top and they get the funding. And when I arrived in DFID, I thought, well, actually, could we use a different model to stimulate innovation? And could we use collaboration versus competition? So we tried something very different. What we did was we, in partnership with the design firm IDEO, actually set up a new platform where we would set the challenge, as donors usually do. But when people applied for funding, everybody else would see their idea. No longer was it a competitive process. And the intention of that was to actually get people to build on each other's ideas, actually form these interesting collaborations. And some really interesting things happened. I mean, we had a small NGO in Nepal linking up with 2 design studios in New York to come up with a new solution. And that, for me, was quite interesting in how do you kind of stimulate this collaboration. It's not just collaboration between innovators that we're looking for. I mean, I'm of the belief that a solution exists for nearly 95% of the problems that are out there at the moment. But the key point is actually how do we create new recipes for these innovations? How do we bring ideas together for the greater good? Similarly, I looked at the donor community and I speak to my equivalent in USAID, in the Australian government, in the Swedish government, in the Gates Foundation. And what struck me was we're all looking at the same damn problems. We're all looking at the MDGs. We'll be all looking at the post-2015 agenda. And the point I think Sharad raised earlier was this one of duplication and inefficiency. Everyone's running off creating their own solutions. So I got us all around the table and said, well, hey guys, I said exactly what I said to you. Now look, we're all looking at the same problems. We're all investing a ton of money in all of this stuff. What would it look like if we came together, pooled our funds? Surely we would spread the risk, the financial risk of innovation. But actually, more importantly, we could scale at a pace beyond which our individual organisations could do alone. And from that was born the concept of the Global Innovation Fund, which our Secretary of State, Justine Greening, and Raj Shah, the USAID administrator, launched in New York 2 months ago, which brings together the UK, US, Australian, Swedish governments, pooling our resources alongside the Omidyar network, so Pierre Omidyar, who is the founder of eBay, to actually move innovation at real scale. Just a final point, again in the interest of time, on collaboration. A lot of people have raised this issue of kind of engaging with the people who we're trying to help in the articulation of problem and the design of solution. And that's a really key principle. This concept of user-led innovation is kind of, again, trying not to use jargon, but using it anyway. It's something that we're really trying to ingrain within DFID at the moment, and actually really speaking to the people who we're trying to help. Because if we're going to move to a world beyond aid, which is, for an organisation like DFID, what we keep talking about, we really need to engage with people to actually make sure the ideas that are generated are relevant, but also sustainable. And it's only when you get the buy-in from the people who are trying to help that you are going to get that sustainability. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think you added one point that was sort of implicit in what has been said by many, but thank you for being so straightforward. So collaboration is key, but it's damn difficult and complex. And it's really also about changing our approach and changing, not only having an innovation culture, but also moving from competition to collaboration and moving beyond a token commitment to collaboration to making it practically work for sharing risks, sharing solutions, and sharing the outcomes. We have a few minutes left to open up the floor for anyone in the room who may want to ask a question. For any questions that may have come up in Twitter that Rebecca would advise us to take up here. Or for anyone here to respond to what has been said by others. Please.
Yeah, thanks. I was able to stay in the end. The voting problems resolved themselves. So that was quite
That's
good.
Wonderful.
I just wanted to, I think it's some really good ideas. And before I was a politician, I worked in local government and worked in economic regeneration in deprived communities and many coal mining areas, and in a way the debates we're having about how do you get people involved in their own regeneration, their own problem solving, are very similar problems. But and we set up community partnerships, and we worked with DG, what was called DG16 at the time, DG Regions, and we had them. We said that the money shouldn't go to projects unless they had community involvement. We did a lot of work, and some of it worked out really well. But one of the problems was the one which was alluded to by somebody, creating false expectations of answer. I think you said that. And also you have to be careful how you do it, because in the end, what happened was we then institutionalized the kind of innovation, if you like. And when we institutionalized the innovation, people started asking questions about, hang on a minute, who are these 10 people on this local group who are involved in deciding where this money goes? Who do they represent really? How do we stop them just giving money to their friends? And then we institutionalized it more and more, and we just created another bureaucratic structure. And then they started to elect the people taking decisions, and we thought, hang on a minute, we've got local councillors, they're elected, they can take. So how do you keep your innovation to get the benefits of it without getting bogged down in structures? And then we had then meetings in communities, and it was supposed to be discussing the regeneration of those communities. But there were more people from agencies there in the end than local people, who frankly got fed up. Because when you spend public money as well, you have to have all the accountability that goes with spending public money. Otherwise, you get the auditors and the press and the media saying, you can have one project that goes wrong, and then the 99 others out of 100 are forgotten, and the one project becomes the one which everyone talks about. So all this innovation involving people are great, but you have to do it to get change. But there's also there are pitfalls, and it's trying to I haven't yet come across how you stop the pitfalls, or maybe you just have to allow them to happen because problems will arise and things will fail. And somehow with public money we never accept failure, where the private sector takes risks and fails all the time.
I think your first point. Oh, sorry. Your first point around expectations. I think that's a tricky one. I think the key principle there is that, and I mention this in DFID all the time, is actually the developing world is not a test bed. It's not something we play with. It's something we have to take very seriously, and we have to be very ethical. I think that, it's an interesting question you raise around kind of the layers of bureaucracy building up on top of what you're trying to do as a very simple idea in the first instance, with our challenge around this open collaboration challenge. And I'll be honest with you, when we said actually to people, when you apply, everyone else sees your idea, a lot of people didn't want to play, which was fine. But what we also got was we actually asked the community to vote on which ideas we would fund, and actually put it out on local radio stations in the developing world and ask the people themselves, well, what do you here are all the ideas piling in. Everyone can see them. What do you think? So we try to kind of democratise the process in that respect. We'll see if it works or not. The projects are still in the pipeline. On the point around risk and managing failure, again, coming from a venture capital background, 9 out of the 10 things I've invested in have failed, and I lost a lot of other people's money before I actually started making money, if I'm being honest with you. And then again, stepping into a government department, suddenly it was quite a culture shock, is all I can say. And I kind of what I try to do within DFID is re-articulate this concept of failure in many ways, and actually reframe the question. And said to the department, well, look, this isn't about managing failure and forget the newspaper for a moment. What the public demand of us is better value for money. And actually, if we are going to get better value for money, we can't carry on as business as usual. Innovation is not a choice, it's a priority. And I suppose on top of that is then the question about actually how do you manage risk. And I think you, very much from the venture capital world, with the funds that I run, you just take that portfolio approach. I think there are different thresholds of evidence behind certain interventions. Maybe you take 20 smaller bets here, but the big bets you take have to be evidence-based. And that's kind of the approach we're very much taking with the funds that we're running.
Sharad, I saw you nodding. Please add to the discussion.
So one of the processes that we always involve is that if there are 10 ideas, we actually get the peers in the room and then discuss with them and then come out with what the peers themselves think is the best idea to move forward with. So that takes away a lot of this spirit, the sense that, why did he get it, why did she not get it? Because they're all, as a collective group, then say, so with MTRAC, when we started in Uganda, there were 85 pilot projects. So Uganda is a graveyard of very successful pilot projects that don't go anywhere because either the funding is lost or the person who was the brain behind it moved out. Yeah. So we brought 85 of those people in the room and said, okay, you're all trying to address the same issue. Choose which is the best approach out of this, and they came out with MTRAC, and that is what we filled in. So that's what. The other thing I keep on saying is that technology is only 10% of the solution. 90% of it is the time you spend in the programming of that. So a lot of people come and say, here is a technology, how can we use it? And we say, no, technology comes last. The 90% is the program itself that you design, and then you figure out if technology helps ease some of your problems. So then programming becomes the key and not the technology. I fully agree about the portfolio approach, but also we ask a question, because people say, what is the cost of failing? And my point is, what is the cost of not doing it? Yeah? Because clearly there is a cost involved of doing it inefficiently. And then what is the cost? So sometimes that works.
As you said, it's about re-articulating what we understand as failure and what we understand as inertia, and where we actually are accountable. And Henrike, I saw you wanted to step in.
No, just very briefly, I mean, a very interesting discussion, and indeed, what's the objective? And I think that's also the thing where we have a lot of confusion still, I mean, certainly on the humanitarian side, but also on others. What are we actually trying to address? And can we congregate around our common objective? And there the objective of the aid agencies and the objective of the beneficiaries and the objective of private people who want to help somehow is not necessarily the same, or maybe in a very wishy-washy way, but it's not really broken down on, okay, so what's the problem, how can we deal with it? I mean, I certainly would take your point very strongly that the kind of leverage you have in private sector to kind of just try something out and then goes wrong, you write it off, you fire your CEO and you start afresh, we don't have at all, and I think not sufficiently in the public sector, because the public sector plays a very big role still in these things. And I think if we, through a discussion like that, which goes around aid efficiency finally in the end, we can kind of break down a little bit this barrier of we can't really dare to do anything because if it goes wrong, we'll all be put into prison. I think that would be extremely, extremely useful.
Please, Louise. We have, just for timekeeping, we have guests already outside the room, so we have to sharp end at 2 o'clock, so we have a few split seconds for the most innovative thoughts. This is the challenge out here.
Sorry, I'll be very quick. I just had some reflection on the discussion that was going around, and I think it's been really obvious looking at humanitarian agencies thinking about innovation as well, and that in urban contexts and new kind of challenges in humanitarianism, there are more actors, and you mentioned, Jonathan, actors of private sector and social enterprises. These are real actors along with governments, especially in urban context. And I think humanitarians are kind of facing the challenges of actually kind of thinking about being facilitation enablers rather than necessarily all the time service deliverers. And that, I think, has come up in the conversation of innovation, and actually trying to really wholly facilitate and let go of some of the control might be a way to kind of get to some of those control and power issues that start to bubble up out of innovation.
I see that it's time, and I see there are lots of questions and issues and ideas that we obviously were not able to fully cover. So please let me just first of all give a very special thanks to Linda McEwan for hosting us here, and to Charlotte for making it all possible. The fact that we're here today is really thanks to your hospitality and for supporting the idea in the first place, for hosting it and making it possible. I would like to thank everyone who has been sitting around me for sharing their ideas, their challenges, their questions. I would like to thank my colleagues, Rebecca in particular, Nicola and Daniel, who is not here today, for doing a tremendous job making it possible. I would like to thank Mr. Jezik for joining in, and we look forward to taking this debate forward. I would like to thank anyone who externally is listening, tweeting, disagreeing, agreeing, nodding their heads, or doing things that we can't pick up right away, but we hope to engage with in the future. I'd like to thank the European Sakharov Prize Network, and apologies again for Hava's message being much less strong through my words. Without further ado, it's been fantastic to have you here. There's many more issues that we want to obviously be discussing. So let's continue the talk. Let's continue the conversation. Anyone around available to join us for a coffee, hang on to Nicola, hang on to myself, and thank you again. You have been a first responder yourself, having operated and worked in many crises in the world, but now you're actually studying specifically what is the role of innovation and technology in humanitarian and refugee assistance. So you will bring a different perspective to the discussion. On my right, it's an honor to introduce Mr. Klaus Rudischhauser, who represents here today as the Deputy Director, the EU Directorate for Development and Cooperation, also known as DG DevCo. And there you are responsible both for the design and now the application of the EU's development policies and the thinking that is sort of emerging out of Brussels and from the many delegations in the field, including also sustainable growth and human and society development. So we look forward to your thoughts. And then to my far right, it's a pleasure also to introduce Mr. Jonathan Wong, who has joined us here today in his capacity as head of the Innovation Hub at DFID, the UK Department for International Development. But more than that, you have also been a social entrepreneur yourself, and you have been advising and doing innovation for many years. So I think it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing your views on the debate. And last but not least, I'm also happy to introduce to you a virtual participant who, while not physically in the room, will be joining us via video message. And the special thanks here go, of course, to the European Parliament Sakharov Prize Network, who has made it possible for us that Ms. Hawa Ibrahim is able to join us via video message. Ms. Hawa Ibrahim is an accomplished and well-recognized Nigerian human rights lawyer, and the European Parliament has recognized her work and her contribution by awarding her in 2005 with the European Sakharov Prize. And I think without further ado, it's now over to Hawa to sort of set us off, and then we will going along the panel, and then we will open up for a discussion. Hawa herself speaks of the power of knowledge, the power of education, and the importance of education being both inclusive, culturally sensitive, empowering, and innovative. And so let's hear what she has to say before we turn back to this room. Over to you, Hawa.
Hello. As we celebrate this milestone of the promise we made to our children, the youth generation yet unborn, to protect and promote their right to survive and to thrive, to learn and to reach their full potentials, may I say congratulations for what we have achieved and for what we are about to achieve. The good book said, acquire knowledge, for indeed the acquisition of knowledge for the sake of Allah engenders reverence.
He's speaking about that, and they're going to be introduced by UNICEF in a few moments' time. The intention of today's is called an Activate talk. And the idea is to think out of the box, I suppose, think about new approaches. And the title is The Promise of Innovation, Saving and Improving Children's Lives. Can Innovation Deliver? So we have to challenge our own assumptions, our own thinking, and hear from these innovatory approaches how we can do things better and differently in the future. So with no further ado, I'll hand over to UNICEF, and I've forgotten your name. Verena, who is going to, compare or moderate this discussion. I may have to leave at some point to go to a meeting about preparing a vote at 3 o'clock, but I'll stay as long as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for hosting us here today, and thank you all for coming and joining us here for the discussion. On behalf of UNICEF and on behalf of Philippe Corrie, the director of the UNICEF office in Brussels, it's an honor to welcome you, and it's an honor also to step in and to try to facilitate and moderate today's discussion. I will try to do my best to make sure that your ideas and your out-of-the-box thinking is made available and shared in this room, and then also taken outside this room through recording and through web streaming and through live tweeting, and that this is really meant to be the beginning of a conversation that we want to continue into the next months and years. It has already been said by Madam Chair that next week we will be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, when it was adopted, was really a global promise to the children of the world that we would do collectively everything we can to have their voices be heard and have their rights realized. And much has, of course, been achieved, and what has worked for many children around the world, though, has not really worked for all of them. So while the gap has grown smaller between rich and poor, north and south, between children in urban and children in rural areas, too many children have their voices still not being heard. Too many children's rights are still being harmed and not realized, and too many children still today are not given the opportunities to really develop to their full potential. And this is really why the series of Activate Talks was invented and launched by UNICEF in the context of this anniversary year, by wanting to dedicate specifically the focus on what innovation can do to close that equity gap, and to bring those children that are still invisible, still out there, still forgotten, into the discussion, and to make sure that the solutions and the approaches and the ideas that exist are really designed for them and really reach them, so that 20 years from now we would be having a very different discussion. So this is why the Activate Talk series was convened, dedicated to innovation for equity, innovation for children. Similar talks have been held in places as diverse as Montenegro or South Sudan, and it's a real honor to be here today at the European Parliament for the first Activate Talk. But now I just want to also, as in my role as moderator, just share with you a few house rules so that we all know what we're in here today. As you know, the Activate talks are either web streamed directly or recorded and later put and made available online. So this one here today will also be recorded. You see our colleague over there who is filming, and everything will be available again and free to be shared, forwarded and disseminated on UNICEF's innovation portal, which you can find on talks.unicef.org. We are also inviting you to tweet, to join the discussion inside the room, from outside the room, and we would invite you to use the hashtag UNICEF Activate so that we can pick up on the conversations and respond. And we also hope that you grabbed your sandwich outside, as much as we hope that there will be food for thought in this room. It's lunchtime after all, so if you haven't done so, maybe on the way out you can. And then maybe one last point. I'm very conscious we have very little time for a very big topic. So in the interest of time, in the interest of everyone's voices being heard, I would ask everyone to be as brief and to the point as possible. And also maybe one more request, which is Brussels specific perhaps. Let's all try to avoid as much jargon as we can. We've tried really hard, but there wasn't any fluent translator who could translate simultaneously from EU speak to DFID speak to UNICEF speak. So we gave up on this. So let's just try to use, a language that also outside anyone who follows this can understand and can make sense of as we go along. Now it's my honor just to now introduce our panelists, innovators, change makers, policy makers, thinkers who are here with us today. On my left, Ms. Henrike Trautmann. She is representing here today the EU Humanitarian Aid and Civil Protection Department, also known as DG ECHO. And in her capacity as head of unit there, she is responsible for many of the most important thematic and cross-cutting issues that will reappear in our discussions today, from nutrition to resilience to disaster risk reduction. But you also bring to the table, of course, both operational and policy-making experience, so you can dip into a whole range of relevant reference points that we look forward to hearing. On my right, Ms. Louise Bloom, you have joined us today from the Humanitarian Innovation Center, which is housed at the Oxford University Refugee Study Center. And on the one hand,
Its search is an act of worship, and its study the glorification of Allah. Its research is a jihad, and its teaching to the ignorant is an act of charity, while offering aid to the scholar is a pious deed. I was born and live all my life in northern Nigeria, in Gombe State. I was a child in a poor family and raised in a Muslim home. My sojourn from a rural village in northern Nigeria to the revolving doors of Harvard University reminds me of the challenge and great opportunities that will all still emanate as we focus on fulfilling our promises of education to our generation yet unborn, which is a cornerstone of hope in our future society. 3 aspects is worthy of mention. Firstly, the integration and innovation of technology, curriculum and equity, the creative ways of teaching and learning. And secondly, the integration of religious moral values within community-specific and traditional knowledge in educational curriculum. Thirdly, the effective utilization of globalization opportunities to further development of education, especially that of children, the girl child, who is disproportionately disadvantaged. Now, balancing the global outlook toward progress is key in providing students with employable skills that will foster productivities and divert them from the temptation of terror, drugs, alcohol, and abuse. Now, wisdom dictates that with education comes employment, and with employment, an individual has the ability to help themselves and their family, especially the parent, and society and beyond. All too frequently in the past, parents have agreed to let their children forsake traditional cultural skill, that is, leaving their tools of trade, including hoes to farm, cutlasses, and rearing of cows and other domestic animals, in order to achieve Western.
So welcome everybody to this special event, which has been organised by UNICEF on innovation and how it can contribute to development. A week from now, on the 20th of November, we're going to celebrate and mark the 25th anniversary of the Rights of the Child Convention, which is a convention that has been most ratified in the world for children's rights. And I think it was a very important convention because for the first time it articulated that children possess innate rights equal to those of adults, the right to health, the right to education, to equal opportunities, to name but a few. In my own country, we've had recently a whole spate of allegations of historic child abuse which happened in the 70s and 80s, often before we had a convention on the rights of the child. And what keeps coming out of all this work of how did this abuse happen? How is it possible that it was tolerated? And a lot of the evidence is that the children were simply not believed because they were not seen as having rights and having the same access to justice as adults were. The adults were believed first. And I think that's a real lesson. And then in the United Kingdom, we changed our approach in social services to child protection, to have a child-centred approach. And that was a direct result of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So it was an extremely important convention in developing countries, but also in many of our countries. So a lot has been achieved. But we still know that many children never get to reach their full potential. Now 17,000 children under 5 die every day. I was trying to think, how many does that mean? While I've been speaking, how many children does that mean have died somewhere in the world because of some reason, which is probably caused by man-made or person-made reason for why children are dying every day, things that we can prevent. That's 6 million children a year. Children dying in poverty, of diseases because they are malnourished or undernourished. And then we're going to hear about the humanitarian and responses and the aid responses we need to give. We as the EU have a particular responsibility. We are the world's biggest donor. The EU and its member states donate 56% of global aid. And so we need to make sure that when we are giving our aid, we do so as effectively as possible, and we make sure that as many children as possible are able to live on to adult life and fulfill their potential. So as the chair of the Development Committee, I'm very happy to host today's event. I'm curious to know about this initiative of innovation and humanitarian aid and what it means in practice. What difference can it make? And we have a number of speakers here who are going to be